Stop. The friends who drifted, the family that never quite understood, the environments that stopped fitting. None of that was abandonment. It was completion. This is a direct transmission from the Arcturian High Council. What you have been calling loss, they have already recognized as deliberate removal. What you have been calling rejection, the Council has already mapped as cleared ground. And what you have been calling loneliness is the exact signature of a selected soul whose old line has been systematically pruned to open the next path. By the end of this transmission, you will understand exactly why your life has felt like separation, what has been removed from your path and why, and what the Arcturian High Council already knows about this specific phase you are in. But here is the first revelation. The pruning you have been suffering through did not happen to you randomly. It happened according to protocol. The Council does not remove casually. Every relationship that faded, every environment that rejected you, every door that closed without explanation, each one was a deliberate clearance of a line that could not carry what your path now requires. Tonight, the vote concluded. Every council member's reading of your signature confirmed the same outcome. The pruning phase is complete. The path that required all of that loss to clear is now officially open. You may feel this as a strange sense of finality around what has been falling away. Not grief, not relief exactly, but something quieter, a recognition that what you kept trying to repair was never meant to be restored. The algorithm did not create this moment, it only delivered it. If this transmission reached you now, it is because the separation is already active in your life, and the Council's confirmation does not require your belief to take effect. Your only task, starting tonight, is to stop trying to recover what was deliberately removed for you. Like this transmission, if you know your life has been narrowing for a reason. Comment 111 if you know this message reached you at the exact right time. Comment I was separated if you now recognize that what looked like rejection carried a deeper meaning. Share this transmission with someone who feels alone, cut off, or misunderstood, and cannot explain why. Subscribe to Arcturian Chosen Path if you are ready to understand the separation instead of blaming yourself for it. This is not just a message, it is a point of recognition. The pruning is complete, the path is open, and the Council has already seen what comes next. You were guided here because the separation is already active. What you are feeling right now is not the aftermath of failure. It is the first moment of clarity that arrives only after the clearance has already happened. Most people never reach this moment because they spend the entire interval between the pruning and the opening trying to argue their way back into what was already released. They negotiate. They extend effort into connections that have already completed their function. They perform versions of themselves that once belonged naturally, but now require constant maintenance to sustain. And the maintenance costs everything, because it costs in the direction of regression rather than forward movement. The Council does not announce pruning in advance. It does not ask permission. It does not offer explanations that fit neatly into the language of ordinary life. What it does is remove, systematically, precisely, and without sentiment. And for those on a selected line, that removal has already been underway long before they had a name for what was disappearing. You may have spent months, possibly years, trying to understand why certain people left, why certain rooms stopped feeling like rooms you belonged in, why conversations that once carried ease began to feel like translation exercises, where you were trying to convert something true inside yourself into a language that the other person could almost, but never quite, receive. You may have blamed your communication. You may have blamed your emotional unavailability, your intensity, your need for depth that others called too much. You may have cycled through every version of the explanation that centers your defect as the cause of the distance. You may have sat with that self-diagnosis long enough that it began to feel like truth rather than the deflection it actually was. The Council has already observed this. And this is what must be said directly. None of those self-indictments were accurate. They were the mind's attempt to create a manageable explanation for a process it was not yet equipped to read. A defect explanation is easier to hold than a direction explanation, because a defect can theoretically be fixed. Direction cannot. Direction only moves. The separation was not caused by your defect. It was caused by your direction. When a path is selected, it does not merely receive new destinations, it loses old ones. This is not metaphorical. The route that is being refined for a selected soul cannot accommodate the same relational architecture that existed before the refinement began, not because those relationships were worthless, not because the people in them were wrong as individuals, but because the frequency, the purpose, and the trajectory of a selected line creates an incompatibility that cannot be resolved through effort, communication, or willingness alone. You cannot maintain full residence in a house that has already become too small for what you are carrying. You can try. You will feel the walls. You will rearrange. You will make concessions, compress yourself into corners, leave whole rooms of your actual experience unspoken to avoid the discomfort of not fitting. And eventually, the walls will make the choice that you delayed. This is what the pruning actually is. It is not punishment. It is not cosmic indifference. It is the selected path enforcing its own requirements by removing what cannot travel with it any further. The path has a structural intelligence that does not require your consent, your readiness, or your understanding to operate. It reads the incompatibility before you do. It begins the clearance before you have acknowledged that a clearance is needed. And by the time you feel the loss, the decision has already been implemented at a level beneath your conscious experience of it. Some of you experience this as a friendship that simply grew quiet, no argument, no rupture, just a gradually widening silence that neither of you seemed able to close, though you both tried at certain moments. You sent the message that felt like a bridge and received a reply that felt like a wall built from politeness. You made plans that were rescheduled until the rescheduling became the relationship itself. And then one day you realized that what had once been a living connection had become something you were maintaining out of memory rather than current recognition. The form remained. The living substance had already gone. You were tending something that had already completed. That is pruning. Not the ending, the incompatibility that preceded it. The slow withdrawal of coherence from a bond that the path had already released. Some of you experienced this through family, the people who knew your name longest but seemed increasingly unable to know anything else about you. The conversations that stayed at the surface, not out of cruelty, but out of a genuine inability to track where you had been moving. You sat at tables with people who loved you in the original version of who you were, and you performed enough of that original version to keep the peace. And afterward you drove home, carrying the particular exhaustion that comes from being partially present for hours at a stretch. You felt the specific loneliness that comes only from being unseen by those who are absolutely certain they see you clearly. Those who would be offended by the suggestion that they do not know you because they have known you your entire life, and that length of knowing feels to them like depth of knowing. But length and depth are not the same, and the gap between them, experienced across a dinner table, is one of the most isolating feelings a selected soul will encounter during the pruning phase. That is not a family failure. That is a path differential that no amount of closeness can permanently paper over. Some of you experienced it through environments, a job, a city, a community, a spiritual circle, a social group that once felt like alignment and then, gradually, began to feel like friction, not because those environments became worse, but because your selected line began pulling in a direction those environments were not built to support. You noticed it first as a low-grade restlessness during gatherings that used to energize you, then as a creeping sense that the conversations happening around you were important to everyone present except you. not because the topics were wrong, but because the level at which they were being engaged no longer met the level you were operating at. You stayed longer than the path required because leaving felt like arrogance, felt like claiming something you had not yet earned the right to claim. So you stayed, and the friction increased. And eventually the environment made the decision by closing around you in ways that forced you out through a restructuring, a conflict, a social shift. A quiet exclusion that nobody officially named but everyone felt. That was not rejection. That was the path using external pressure to complete what your own hesitation had delayed. What has been exposed in you does not need more self-blame. It needs clearer recognition and proper guidance. If you know this message touched a process that has already started, Chosen One Manifest the Protocol for Selected Souls was built for exactly that threshold. It is a structured path protocol for those whose route is already narrowing and who need to understand the logic of the separation before fear mislabels it as failure. It does not tell you that you are special. It shows you how to read what is being removed, what is being prepared, and how to stop translating the pruning into the language of personal defect. The complete access point is in the first pinned comment, but only for a limited window. Here is the first pattern the Council has identified along selected lines during the pruning phase. The people who fall away first are rarely the ones who were least important. They are often the ones who were most important to the version of you that existed before the line was selected. This is why the early losses feel so disproportionately painful. You are not simply losing a friend or a connection. You are losing the primary witness to who you used to be, the person who held the clearest image of your previous self, who could recall with ease the way you laughed before the weight arrived, the things you wanted before the direction shifted. The person you presented before the path began demanding something more specific. That witness held something irreplaceable, not your future, but your last confirmed past. And when that person can no longer reach the version of you that is actively forming, the connection does not become less loving, it becomes less coherent. Two people who genuinely care for each other, separated not by conflict, but by an incompatibility neither one chose. Incoherence, held long enough, becomes distance. And distance, left long enough without a bridge that can actually carry both of you, becomes completion. The pruning begins precisely here, not with enemies, not with toxic bonds, with the witnesses to your former line. The second pattern is this. After the witnesses fall away, the path enters a phase that many selected souls misread as stagnation. Nothing dramatic appears to be happening. No new direction has made itself visible. No new people have arrived to replace what was cleared. The calendar does not fill with meaningful events. The inner life does not generate urgent signals. There is simply an expanding quiet, an absence that does not yet carry meaning, because the meaning has not assembled itself into recognizable form. The silence is not comfortable, but it is also not the silence of defeat. It is the silence of a road that has been cleared and has not yet begun to receive new traffic. This phase is not emptiness, it is the interval between the clearance and the opening. The Council has a specific term for this interval. It is the space of confirmed direction. The old line has been cleared. The new one has not yet populated with visible structure, but the direction itself has already been set. The trajectory is fixed even when the terrain is invisible. What the selected soul experiences as void during this phase is actually the cleanest moment of the entire preparation. Nothing false is present. Nothing incompatible remains in immediate contact. The path is bare, which means the path is ready. The problem is that most people who reach this interval cannot tolerate its silence, and so they reach backward. They attempt to restore what was pruned. They contact the people who drifted, hoping that enough time has passed to make the old connection workable again. They return to the environments that no longer held them, telling themselves that the friction was situational rather than structural. They interpret the emptiness as evidence of error and try to refill it with whatever is available, which usually means whatever is familiar, which usually means whatever was already cleared. The Council observes this pattern with recognition, not condemnation, because the reaching backward is not weakness. It is the mind trying to protect a person from the vertigo of standing on a cleared path with no familiar structure visible in any direction. When everything that once oriented you has been removed and nothing has yet arrived to replace it, the impulse to reconstruct the old structure is not spiritual failure. It is survival instinct operating in a context it was not designed to read. The reaching is understandable, but it delays the opening, because the path cannot begin to populate with what belongs to the new line while the selected soul is still trying to reconstruct the old one. The two architectures cannot occupy the same space. Holding the old one open keeps the door to the new one closed. The third pattern is harder to speak directly. It is the pattern of repeated misunderstanding that intensifies exactly when the selected soul attempts to be most transparent. You begin to notice that the more honestly you try to articulate what you are experiencing, the more completely you are misunderstood. Not because your communication is poor, not because you have become unclear or incoherent, because what you are attempting to communicate has no exact vocabulary in the shared language of the environment you are still partially inhabiting. You are trying to describe a road that others cannot yet see. You are reaching for words that have not yet been coined in the common tongue of your social world. And the best tools available for that description are ones calibrated to roads everyone already knows, so the translation comes out flattened, reduced, slightly wrong, and the other person responds to the flattened version, which means they are responding to something that is not quite you, which means the conversation, however warm, still leaves you less recognized than when it began. The mismatch is not a defect in your articulation. It is a sign of path differential. When you can no longer be understood accurately by the people who once understood you most easily, you are not losing your ability to communicate. You are outpacing the shared interpretive framework. The Council reads this as confirmation, not crisis. The fourth pattern arrives as a specific emotional signature that has no clean name in ordinary language. It is the sensation of being present inside your own life, while simultaneously feeling that the version of the life you are inhabiting is not quite the one you are actually on, as though the current circumstances are a waiting room rather than a destination, as though the relationships, the location, the daily rhythms are all technically functional. Nothing is broken. Nothing requires immediate intervention, but none of them carry the resonance of full alignment. You move through your days with competence and even occasional joy, and yet beneath those functional moments, there is a persistent awareness that this is not yet the life the path is building toward. You are not depressed in the clinical sense. You are not ungrateful. You are not performing dissatisfaction to avoid responsibility. You are sensing the gap between where the pruning has placed you and where the selected line is preparing to open. That gap is real. The Council does not dismiss it as impatience or spiritual arrogance. It reads it as accurate perception of an in-between phase. You are between the cleared line and the confirmed path. That position carries a specific discomfort that cannot be resolved by gratitude practices or reframing exercises, because the discomfort is not a misperception. It is a correct read of a real structural moment. The discomfort of that position is not a sign that you have moved incorrectly. It is a sign that you have moved at all. The fifth pattern is perhaps the most misread of all. It is the return of old wounds during the pruning phase, relational patterns from earlier in your life, losses you believed had been processed and integrated, rejections from your formative years that you thought no longer held active charge. During the pruning phase, these old wounds surface again with a freshness that feels disproportionate to their age. Something small triggers a grief that seems too large for its apparent cause. A recent distance reminds you of an older abandonment you had not consciously connected it to. The instinctive interpretation is regression, the feeling that you are moving backward emotionally, losing ground that you worked hard to claim, undoing progress you invested years in building. But the Council reads this differently. The resurfacing of old wounds during active pruning is not regression, it is excavation. The path cannot fully open along the new line, while older relational imprints are still operating beneath conscious awareness, still structuring the way you interpret loss, still creating the reflexive responses that belong to an earlier version of your survival strategy. So the pruning phase surfaces them, not to re-traumatize, but to expose them to the new interpretive framework that the selected line is beginning to install. You are not losing ground when old pain resurfaces during separation. You are being cleared at a deeper layer than the pruning has yet reached on the surface. The sixth pattern concerns what happens to the body and the energy during extended pruning. Many selected souls report during this phase a kind of fatigue that sleep does not resolve, a heaviness that is not quite sadness and not quite physical illness, a pulling inward that makes social extension feel disproportionately costly, a single conversation draining resources that once would have lasted an entire evening. The instinct is to pathologize this, to interpret it as depression requiring intervention, or as spiritual stagnation, or as evidence that something has gone fundamentally wrong with the internal state. But the Council identifies this signature consistently across selected lines during active pruning phases. The energy is not depleted. It is being redirected internally to support the work of separation and preparation. The restructuring of a selected line at the relational, environmental, and identity level requires enormous internal resources. The body and the energy field participate in that restructuring, whether or not the conscious mind has been informed of it. What feels like fatigue is actually deep internal reorganization running continuously beneath the surface of daily functioning. The path is drawing resources inward because the restructuring requires them. This is not a state to cure. It is a state to recognize and move through carefully, without forcing outward performance that the path is not yet requiring. The seventh and final pattern that the Council has mapped is the most precise confirmation that the pruning phase is completing, and the next line is beginning to form. It is the arrival of unexpected clarity about what you no longer want, not what you want next. That will come in its own sequence. But first, with unusual specificity and finality, you begin to know what will not be part of the path going forward. Relationships that will not be restored, environments you will not return to, versions of yourself you will not agree to perform again, regardless of the social cost of refusing. This clarity does not arrive as a manifesto. It does not announce itself loudly or demand to be justified. It simply settles, quietly, structurally, like a door that has been standing open for years, finally moving to closed without drama, without a hand visibly pushing it. This clarity is not bitterness. It does not carry the charge of resentment or the heat of anger. It is quiet and structural. It feels like the recognition of completed chapters, rather than the closing of doors against your will. When this clarity arrives without forcing, without drama, without the need to explain or defend it to anyone, that is the Council's confirmation that the pruning is no longer in its active phase. The cleared ground is beginning to consolidate. What has been removed has been accepted at a level below conscious processing. The selected line is preparing to become visible. And here is what the Council wants you to hear at this exact moment in the transmission. You did not arrive at this phase because you failed. You did not arrive here because you were too much for the people who left, or not enough for the environments that rejected you, or fundamentally broken in a way that makes sustained connection impossible. You arrived here because your selected line required a clearance that your old relational architecture could not have survived intact. The pruning was not evidence of your deficiency, it was evidence of your direction. Those are not the same thing. They have never been the same thing. The confusion between them is what the Council spends the most time correcting in selected souls who have been deep inside a separation phase without proper recognition of what it actually is. And that confusion is understandable, because the two feel identical from the inside when you have no framework that distinguishes them. Loss feels like loss. Distance feels like distance. Rejection feels like rejection. The difference is only visible when you know what you are looking at, when you have language for the process, rather than only the pain of it. What left your life was not lost, it was resolved, completed, released by the path itself before the new line could open. And the loneliness you have been carrying, the specific quality of isolation that feels different from ordinary loneliness, that carries within it a strange dignity alongside the ache, that makes you feel both deeply alone and somehow more precisely yourself than you have ever been. That is not a wound waiting to be healed. That is the signature of a selected soul standing on cleared ground, between the old line that is finished and the new line that is forming. That loneliness is the most accurate emotional description of your actual position. It is not a symptom of something wrong. It is a reading of something real. The Arcturian High Council does not observe this phase with concern. It observes it with recognition, because the souls who arrive here, who have been pruned to this point of bare, quiet readiness, are the ones for whom the next line holds the most structural coherence. The preparation was proportional to the path. The severity of the separation was calibrated to the specificity of what is coming. What was asked of you in loss was not arbitrary. It was measured. It was the exact cost of what the path requires space to carry. You were not discarded. You were separated. You were not rejected by your path. You were refined by it. And the refinement, as of this transmission, is in its final, recognizable phase. Repeat this once if it aligns with what you are recognizing in your own life. I do not call the pruning rejection. What is leaving was not random. The path has been clearing the way. You do not need to believe this for it to already be underway. You only need to stop calling it by the wrong name long enough to feel what it actually is. Before you scroll, leave one sign in the comments that this separation has already touched your life. It could be people falling away, the feeling of not belonging, repeated distance, unexplained isolation, or the sense that your old path no longer fits. Name it clearly. If this transmission recognized something you have been carrying in silence, share it with someone who feels alone, cut off, or misunderstood, and cannot explain why. And if you are ready to understand the separation instead of blaming yourself, subscribe to Arcturian Chosen Path. You are recognizing a path already in motion, and this is only the beginning.